So recently on Facebook, I posted a photograph of myself with two other wonderful friends of mine. And under that post, another friend, a male friend, chimed in a comment, "Charlie's Angels." And I thought, oh, super cute. That's very flattering, right? Because I think of the Charlie's Angels as these three women who are not only very attractive, but also savvy and powerful solvers of crime in Los Angeles. So this was a cool thing, right? And so there was a little debate on Facebook as to which one of us was which angel. And of course, I took claim to being the blonde one. You know, that's right, I'm the blonde angel. But no, more seriously, what happened is when this person actually typed Charlie's Angels, he didn't actually type Charlie's Angels. Probably due to autocorrect, he actually typed Charlie's Angles. A-N-G-L-E-S, Charlie's Angles. And so my first very nerdy response to this was to think about isosceles triangles and all that sort of, angles. And so my nerd response to this was, well then, I get to be the right angle. 90 degrees, right? And this was a very instant response. And, like most jokes, there's a little bit of truth in this joke for me, which is speaking to the fact that historically, maybe a little bit here today, but definitely a ton throughout the first 3 decades of my life, I was very attached to being right. Being right was very important to me. Being smart, being on, having it together, but definitely being right, such that it took coming into my spiritual journey in my 30s for me to, for the first time ever claim that I was wrong at anything. I mean, that's how core this issue was for me. And so you might imagine, throughout my life, I had this preoccupation with doing things right, with being right, such that high school, valedictorian, went to Stanford Law. I had all of these things that were out there proving this outerness, of my being right. So you might imagine with this kind of background, what it was like for me when I had this one experience in college that felt completely humiliating. Basically, I was chatting with my college boyfriend, and just talking about my day with all these big words that I was using. And I said, wow, everything's going awry today. And he looks at me with this quizzical expression on his face. And then he realizes what I'm trying to say, and he bursts out laughing. "Do you mean awry?" Oh, A-W-R-Y. And I gasped, and I was completely humiliated in that moment with this whole ego around being so smart and so great. I had mispronounced this word. Now, the background, of course, as many of you know, I was born in Vietnam. English is technically not my first language. My native language is actually Vietnamese. And I was educated because I read a lot. And so when you read, no one tells you how to pronounce words, right? And so all my life I thought it was Ari until this moment in college. But I remember in that moment he laughed, and I felt really offended. I'm like, what? I was like, I can't believe you laughed at me. I felt horrified. And his reaction was, Tweety. My name was Nhien. And so he called me Tweety. And he was like, "Tweety, I'm only laughing because it's such a beautiful thing. Do you realize that whereas you're holding it like there's something to be ashamed about in this, hearing you said that made me love you more. Because you were so human in that moment. You don't always look that human, and you were so human in that moment. And it kind of blew me away. I mean, of all our memories that we have in college, this one actually really stood out for me. And that's kind of telling about my background and what a big deal it was to have in that moment something that horrified me, right? Like if I was in front of other people, how horrifying that would be. But it was enough that he laughed at me. But instead of going to this shame place, he invited me to come to a place of receiving love, because I was expressing an aspect of what it just means to be human, which is that I made a mistake. And so it is with this story that I revisit this book, The Gifts of Imperfection. It's with this story that I'm reminded of something that is very powerful, that's something that I do have to consistently remind myself of, which is it is in our outer imperfection, if you will. It's in the daily mistakes that we make that we connect with one another. And we do so, I came to realize, because if you really think about it, imperfection is universal, right? We've all done stuff that we feel embarrassed about, that we feel isn't right, that we feel ashamed about. We've all fall short of the mark as to ourselves, much less the world around us. And so in him seeing me in that way, that reminded me simply of this idea that when we show up in ways that feel more broken, that kind of shatter that shell, that image of perfection that we might put out into the world, we show up in a way that enables other people to connect with us more, because they're connecting with a part of themselves is doing in this book. And what I hope to do here with all of you is to invite you for these next 5 weeks to focus on what it means to be real. So it's not like saying, hey, let's emphasize the ways we think we're imperfect, but more so to own these ways, to own them with each other in a way that helps us each to connect with our humanity and to more fully embrace our humanity. That's the first part of what I want to do here today. And just to give you a little heads up, I'm going to invite a couple folks to share their stories around shame and how they work through that. But the second piece to this, and the piece that I feel is important to offer that maybe goes beyond the scope of Brene Brown's book, is that while we all have this in common as a part of our humanity, there is something I also believe we have in common as a part of our divinity. And it sounds paradoxical, but to me the entire spiritual journey is that way, which is this. While our egoic structure, while our human selves are imperfect, I wholeheartedly believe in this fundamental unity teaching that at core, in essence, we are all whole and perfect. And how can we hold both of those? And I think ironically, when I know that deeper spiritual identity as being whole and perfect, then I'm actually less attached to needing that outer identity to be perfect, right? Because there's something more essential to me that's perfect. So with that, I want to invite Britt up first to share a story. She's one of our facilitators for our class, The Gifts of Imperfection, to share her story. Welcome, Britt. Yeah.
I did the same thing you did. Hi, everybody. So this topic, anytime I'm asked to share vulnerably or authentically, I kind of want to puke a little bit. So it's been really fun working with this whole revisiting this book. So the story I wanted to share when I was thinking about one of the things Brene Brown talks about is letting go of the need to care what other people think, letting go of the need to care about the image. And so Nhien shared last week on the Grace Talk that, I really wanted to change my career, so I made a decision to go to grad school to become a therapist. So cool. So I found the money to go to school, and then I realized I still had to eat and pay rent and pay bills, and so what am I going to do? And then I realized, well, I've been waiting tables since I'm 13 years old and I'm good at it, so I'll just go do that at 30 years old. So my family story, and I don't talk much about my family, but my family story is my parents came from nothing. I was the first person in my family to go to college. I don't think my mom graduated high school. And so there was a lot of shame around poverty. And so my job was to go and make up for all of that. So my image was really, really important. So I remember the day I called home and said, I'm 30 and I'm going to go waitress now. And just the shame and the horror that I got from my family is terrible. And so I'm like, okay, I can deal with that. So I go and anyone here ever worked in a restaurant before? Yeah. My peeps. Okay. So I'm like, I got my nonstick shoes, my $20 bank, my wine key, my apron. I'm like, I know how to do this, right? And I'm like, okay, I'm the oldest person in the restaurant. I'm older than the managers. I'm older than the head chef. Like, crap. Sorry, Nhien. That's the only bad word I'll say. Okay, so I'm like, okay, I can do this, whatever. And it was a restaurant in Leawood, and a million years ago when I lived here, I worked at an ad agency, and I hated it, and it was horrible. And my old supervisor came in with, I think, 4 or 5 of my old coworkers, and they were sat in my section. And I walked up to the table with my little shtick, and I just kind of went, and they're like, Britt, what are you doing here? And just the look of contempt on their faces, it was horrifying. Like, I left that job and it was horrifying anyway, but I just remember these 5 girls just like staring at me, just like, failure, pathetic, weak. I already had that shame story in my head to begin with, but then to like have to stand there and like uncork their wine and give them a little taste and like, ugh. I've never spit in someone's food, but man, if there ever was a time, it would have been that moment. I was horrified. I just wanted to give up. I had a good job. I had that moment of, what am I doing? Like, this might never work, and this is just, I can't do this. It's way too horrifying. I hate being asked, what do you do? Because then I have to say I'm a waitress, but I have this other stuff going on too. And it was like, anytime someone asked me, I had to qualify it. Because I'm a waitress, but this, and I'm a waitress, but that. And I remember one night praying, like, okay, if I never do anything but wait tables, I'm enough, and I'm lovable, and I affirmed, and I affirmed, and I affirmed. And I kept at that job, and I stayed at it, and it worked out pretty good. And I remember one of my favorite authors, Brennan Manning, in his book, and he kind of covers the same thing from a different perspective, but he says, it is better to be than to appear to be. And I love that. It is better to be than to appear to be. And I had spent my whole life trying to appear to be this or to appear to be that. But like standing there in my non-skid shoes at that table, that was pretty much as real as I was getting, carrying trays of their food over, fixing in all their stuff. And then I thought, do I care so much about what these people think of me that I'm willing to sacrifice my entire dream for 5 people who I have not seen since, like ever. Like I have never run into them again. Nowhere in town have I seen them. I cared so much about the committee in my head that I was willing to sacrifice who I was, what I was about. And I am so glad that I didn't, because that worked out pretty good. And if everything goes to hell, I'm a really good waitress, so I can always fall back on that. So I'll hopefully not see you there, but so that's my real story.
Thank you, Britt. And actually, I'll invite you to stay up here. Beautiful. Just to kind of feel some more of that exposure. And while you're up here, let's sandwich Jen in, and I invite our other facilitator for our Gifts of Imperfection program to share a story. I'm using 2 mics. Let me just preface this really quickly with the idea that when we gathered together to plan for this Gifts of Imperfection class, And it amazed me, the powerful experience that we had when it was really Jen that opened up first to share a vulnerable story with us. And it's really courageous of her to be willing to share that story also here before all of you strange people that she doesn't know, you know. But really it told us that, you know, I mean, here we really believe that there's nothing that leadership should ever ask of others that we are not willing to do ourselves. And so to set this stage where we among ourselves are sharing at a deeper level with each other, to open our hearts to each other and expose ourselves to each other, that is a good foundation for which we're going to hold space for everyone on Tuesday. So that's what Tuesday will be an opportunity to share at this deeper level. So with that, Jen, thank you.
Stay.
Yeah.
So what came up during our conversation, and we were sitting outside here, by the way, it was such a challenging meeting. I mean, eating alley food and all, and ended in cake. But to be able to be with two women who we could be authentic with each other and be vulnerable. And one of the things we were talking about was, you know, okay, we're co-facilitating. So that means 3 people in one class. What does that even look like? And so Nhien had asked, you know, are there things that have been coming up for you as you've been reading the book? You know, so that we make sure that we're touching on those key topics and key ideas. So I said, you know, immediately, I was reading the book, and Brene shares this little story of something that happened in her life, and she prefaces it with something like, you know, shame researcher, you know, watch yourself or something. And I'm reading this story going, oh my gosh, she has the same voices in her head that I do. And it was this immediate connection with that shame spiraling voice that happens sometimes. And I want to say, right, I'm a Unity minister, been spending the last 3 years at seminary school. I've got a pretty good toolbox to help dig myself out of situations. So when the inner voice starts telling me, oh, you did that wrong, or, you know, you didn't turn the microphone on, that made you look bad. When those voices come up, I can go, yes, but I'm perfect in spirit, or, you know, I can pray on this, and I can meditate on this, and I can work myself out of it. And sometimes that takes longer than others. And sometimes that spiraling seems to happen quicker than others. And this is, for me, what I shared the other day. I said, I read Brene Brown's book, that particular chapter, that section there, and I thought, oh my gosh, it's the toaster oven story. My husband's smiling because he knows this story as well. He was right there. He and I were standing in the kitchen chatting, and it's an itty-bitty kitchen. And I happened to be roasting kale, of all things, in my toaster oven. And we noticed a little spark at the bottom of the toaster oven. Little flame went off. And he goes, it'll go out. It'll put itself out. So we're both standing there watching it, and it didn't go out. It got bigger, and it got bigger, and it got bigger. And so I unplugged the thing, and I moved the paper towels from above it. But as this fire started growing, and we're realizing there was something stuck at the bottom of the tray that was dripping down and creating this fire to grow and grow to the point where the flames are coming out from the toaster, sitting on the counter. And I froze. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I was just like, electrical fire, what do you do? And it's like everything in my head is trying to like play out. And meanwhile, while I'm standing there completely frozen, Dan's like, I'm gonna go get some water. Goes to get some water, sprays the thing down, and it went out. So we were fine. Toaster oven is not. House was fine. No more damage done than we lost a toaster oven. That was it. The story in my head that night grew and grew and grew and grew, to the point where it started with, well, you should have known better. You should have done something differently. You should have not frozen. And because you froze, you could have caused a fire to the entire house. The whole thing could have gone up in flames. Your family was there, Jen. You could have killed everybody. And this is the story that's going off. And when that voice went off, then it said, well, you are an unfit mother. And Britt shared that her story is around prosperity and around abundance and finances. And for me, it's motherhood, right? That is who I want to be, who I want to serve the most in my life is my son and being able to be there for him. So the moment that that voice went off, wow. And all the prayers, the meditation, I'm just going to go for a walk. Okay, I'm just going to go sit over here a minute. It was not going away. It was feeding itself. And I was sort of that observer hearing the voice feed itself going, well, this is crazy. I sound like a crazy person in my head. I really did. And luckily, it happened to be, of all things, World Day of Prayer. So I chose to go out to Unity Village to the concert that was going on that evening, surrounded by friends who, when I met them, they're like, hey, how are you? I said, I'm not okay. I'm not okay. And they gave me space to share what was going on for me. And after the music was over, I had a friend who stayed with me for hours. We talked about other things as well, but she really let me process that voice that was going on in my head. And not in the, well, it's okay, Jen, you shouldn't listen to that voice, but just, wow, that's what you heard, huh? That's what the voice was saying. And to that point where I could recognize and claim what was going on, claim that shame, recognize what my trigger point was and why it had gotten so bad, I was able to see it for what it was and really be able to walk out of that concert experience and come home to Dan and be like, okay, I'm fine now, you know? But it was really being able to claim it first, and I think that's what Brene gives us the opportunity to do, and what we hope that this class gives us the opportunity to do. Not necessarily that everybody needs to stand up to a microphone and air the voices in their head, but that we can all sit in a room together and honor the experience for everybody else that's going through it as well. So we hope to see you Tuesday night and
Thank you, Jen.
see where Nhien takes this.
Yeah. Thank you. You can hear it. All right. So, yeah, thank you so much for your sharing of these stories. And it's true, we will not force you to take a mic and share at this group, but the reason I invited the sharing of these stories is I was the beneficiary of this kind of sharing. You know, as many of you know, I started out in 12-step rooms, and it was sitting in rooms where people said things that were to me unfathomable, like how can you share this publicly? But by their sharing of things that they were ashamed about, I was able to tap into the things that I was most ashamed about and feel like I wasn't alone in that. And so there's, you know, it's the courageous people who do that that help us all to realize that we are not alone. You are not alone if you yell at your children. You know, you are not alone if you had a relapse in your addiction. You know, you are not alone if you are still grieving the loss of your parent after 30, 40 years. You know, to allow people to share things that aren't the norm and have that space held so that we know that we are not alone in our humanity, in the ways in which we only think we are different from others because we have failed to share in this space, this sacred space, right? And so we want to start intentionally opening that up as we have here in U-NITE, but also even further to continue that with our groups. So that's so important for me. And as Brene Brown says, you know, and as we hear in 12 steps, you know, in 12 steps you hear, you are as sick as the secrets that you keep. And Brene Brown shares likewise that it is in the silence that shame can grow. It is through silence that this shame grows. And so for us to truly start healing, we need to open up with one another. I want to share just a few quotes from the book that stood out for me. Our experience of shame, Brene Brown says, it's the intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. And shame is basically the fear of being unlovable. It's the total opposite of owning our story and feeling worthy. Shame is all about fear. We're afraid that people won't like us if they know the truth about who we are, where we come from, what we believe, how much we're struggling, or believe it or not, how wonderful we are when soaring. Sometimes it's just as hard to own our strengths as our struggles. And people often want to believe that shame is reserved for the folks who have survived terrible traumas. But this is not true, she says. And this researcher, Brene Brown, says, shame is something we all experience. And while it feels as if shame hides in our darkest corners, it actually tends to lurk in all of the familiar places, including appearance and body image, family, parenting, money and work, health, addiction, sex, aging, and religion. To feel shame is to be human. The stories of our struggles are difficult for everyone to own, and if we've worked hard to make sure everything looks just right on the outside, the stakes are high when it comes to truth-telling, and this is why shame loves perfectionists. I want to move briefly into this core idea that's embodied in a story about the Golden Buddha. How many of you have heard this story? Just curious, the Golden Buddha. Okay, just Jen. So it's this story. Basically, back in like 1957 or so, these monks were trying to move a clay Buddha statue. And in moving it, the statue started to crack. And as it started to crack, they got all fearful again. It was like, we better not move this thing. Let's put it back, try to repair it, put a tarp over it, make sure the rain doesn't go on it. So they moved it back. But then, the lead monk at the time went back and was checking out the tarp, making sure it was all secure. And he noticed through one of the cracks that there was something shiny behind the clay. And so he looks a little closer with his flashlight. It's dark at the time. And he realizes there's gold under this clay. That apparently history says that years ago, that when the monks in Tibet were being attacked, what they did was they hid the gold Buddha under clay so it wouldn't be stolen. And so that's how the story goes. But it's this idea for us, right? That for me, this idea of what is cracked is this outer clay. It's our human identity. But that which is golden is our spiritual identity. That which is golden, that which can shine. And so here's the thing about our imperfections. Yes, at one level, I think it's important to be able to share and own this sense of the ways in which we are imperfect. But I also think people can overly dwell in that, where it's celebrated. I think of Married with Children, that sitcom, as embodying the way we revel in imperfection. We almost make it a god, if you will. For me, it's not about that so much as it's owning, hey, in this moment where this clay was cracked in me, it's not just about in this crack I recognize that really the clay of all humanity is cracked. But I also, in the midst of recognizing this crack in me, this outer shell of humanity, if I gaze more deeply, I can actually tap into a knowing of something that is whole and essential, that is not cracked or crackable, if you will. That is the light that shines through to me in that song. There is a crack in everything. That's where the light comes in, but that's also where the light comes out. So in that opening, we're able to then release some of our attachment to this identity, because the need to be right, to me, for me, came from the knowing that I really wasn't all right. But in the midst of owning my outer imperfection, if I could go deeper and become more still to a knowing of something that was behind that, rather than try to repair the crack and put more clay on it through accomplishments and all these things that prove I really am right and better, right, and smarter. Instead of doing that, if I can uncover that and get behind that and know a deeper truth, then I know my God self, then I know my light. Then I can celebrate that these outer imperfections are a path to a greater knowing of my innate beauty. And that beauty, there's a slide that shares another story about a form of art. Some of you might have heard of it. Kintsugi, which is a Japanese form of art that is based on the fact that, like, when a piece of pottery is cracked, the old way was to just try to repair it as best you can, with these like ugly tools. But they decided that instead of doing that, we're going to repair it with gold, with these beautiful elements, and we will make it part of the art itself. And we will make something more beautiful from that which was cracked. And so it was with that idea that I invite us to take this journey together, to be willing to own our realness in a different way. Are you for real? To me, is about owning this outer imperfection, but also about owning this inner radiance too, all at once. And so I want to close this time and open us into a time of meditation with a quote from Brene Brown, who makes this invitation for us. Owning our story can be hard, but not nearly as difficult as spending our lives running from it. Embracing our vulnerabilities is risky, but not nearly as dangerous as giving up on love and belonging and joy, the experiences that make us the most vulnerable. Only when we are brave enough to explore the darkness will we discover the infinite power of our light. I invite you to close your eyes as Victor guides us into this time, as we remember, yes, there is a crack in everything. That is how the light gets in, that's how the light goes out. So as you close your eyes, I invite you to take a deep breath and bring to mind something in your life or self that you feel is imperfect or broken. Maybe like Jen, it's something that happened in the area of parenting. Or like Britt, in the area of a career or finances or image. Or like me, the area of being right and thus worthy. What area do you feel fallible, cracked? I invite you to bring a compassionate awareness to that place, kind of like what my ex did for me, when I would have otherwise applied judgment or shame. Bring loving awareness to that space in you that feels wrong or broken or unworthy. Maybe in your mind's eye, you might want to give yourself a hug. Tell yourself that you are worthy of love and belonging. And then I invite you to apply that compassion across this room here, knowing that there are others here who have been suffering in a sense of shame for what they believe is unworthy in themselves. Allow your compassion to radiate out into the space of this room. doing this, feel that knowing that not only are you loved, but you are love. You are love itself, radiating through the cracks of each person's imperfections. And allow yourself to bask for a moment as this room is filled with compassion for our individual and collective humanity, the ways in which we feel hurt and alone. Allow that compassion to fill you up and overflow. And take some time now to feel this love here now in the silence.